Have you ever heard of a man who woke up one night to find a bleeding Bigfoot under his cabin floor and chose to save it? In the remote woods of Whisper Ridge, a grieving father and a hunted creature forged a bond no one could explain. Hollow, a being feared by many, didn't roar or attack. He sat by the fire, drank from a cup, and listened quietly to the harmonica. But the forest was watching, and so were the hunters. This isn't just a story about monsters. It's about healing, about how Clinton Ward, a lonely man who lost his son in a wildfire, found purpose again through an unexpected friendship with something the world calls a myth. And maybe, just maybe, that creature had met his son before. Years later, another lost soul, a boy, was guided out of the storm by footprints that led to a grave. And on that grave, a symbol of gratitude shone faintly in the mist. If this story found its way to you, maybe it's meant to remind you, compassion goes beyond species, and some connections live forever in the quiet of the woods. So tell me, where in the world are you watching from? How far can this story travel? And who else needs to hear it tonight? With all our hearts, thank you for being here. It was late October in Whisper Ridge, the kind of cold that settled into old wood and lungs alike. Wind hissed through the pines like breath between teeth, carrying with it the bitter tang of iron, and something colder still, the scent of first snow. In the black hollow of night, Clinton Ward stirred beneath heavy wool blankets, his breath rising slow and visible in the air. He was 64, a man weathered by seasons, both the ones in the forest and the ones within. But this wasn't a normal waking. Something pulled him from sleep like a hook through the chest. A smell, not smoke, not pine, metal. Wet, sharp, wrong. He sat up in the silence, listening. There it was, below the floorboards. A ragged breath, then another. The deep drag of lungs full of pain. Wood creaked beneath weight not meant to be there. Not a raccoon, not a bear. Too heavy, too slow. Clinton reached for the old kerosene lamp on the nightstand, struck the flint with shaking fingers. Flame bloomed, soft and amber, casting shadows that moved like old ghosts across the cabin walls. He stood barefoot on cold boards, bones aching with every step, and walked toward the center of the room, heart thudding. The hatch to the crawlspace was half open. That alone made his gut tighten. He never left it open. He knelt, lamp in one hand, lifted it just enough to angle the light downward, and froze. Below him, curled against cracked dirt and splintered joists, was a body, massive, coated in matted dark brown fur, soaked through with blood that shone slick in the lamplight. One shoulder rose and fell, labored. Its limbs were twisted, heavy, not quite human, but not fully beast. But it was the eyes that held him there. Amber, clear, lit from within like candlelight in a cave. They looked up at him, not with fear, but with a question, a plea. Clinton didn't speak, not yet. He backed away slowly, upright, breath stuck in his chest. He turned toward the back door and saw it, blown wide open. Hinges bent, mud tracked in thick arcs across the floorboards. Big, wide prints, bipedal, not bare. Someone or something had driven it here, had chased it. He stood still for a moment, in the quiet. In another life, he might have reached for the phone, called fish and wildlife, reported an injured animal. But his hand didn't move. Instead, his eyes flicked to the mantel, to the photo of a young man in Ranger green. Owen, his boy, smiling with the edge of someone who thought he had time. Clinton blinked hard. The wind outside moaned against the cabin. He stepped back toward the hatch and knelt again. The creature hadn't moved, save for its eyes. Watching. Its chest heaved with effort. Blood seeped slow into the dirt beneath it. Clinton whispered, voice dry and low. You came to the wrong house, but maybe the right heart. For a moment, nothing. Then, it moved. One long arm, muscle trembling, reached toward him. Fingers, yes, fingers, not paws, brushed his boot, lightly, as if seeking permission, seeking grace. Clinton swallowed. The contact wasn't cold, wasn't rough. It was deliberate. Human, in a way he didn't want to name yet. He stayed there a while, lamp casting gold halos on wood and fur. No words, just breath, just quiet. When morning came, the cabin smelled of antiseptic and pine. Clinton had moved the creature, no, the being, up into the corner of the cabin near the stove, onto a mattress stripped down to wool blankets. He'd cleaned the worst of the wounds, pressed cloth to torn flesh. The thing hadn't protested, just breathed. And then he saw it, caught in the bloodied fur near its ribs. A shard of rusted metal. Not natural. Clinton turned it in his fingers. It was old, jagged on one end, but the other side bore a symbol. A stream, winding through a mountain, crudely carved, but unmistakable. He knew it because his son had etched that same symbol into the post at Fire Tower 9 the summer before he died. It took his breath away. His knees went weak. The thing lying in his cabin, half dead, had carried this. Not recently. It had been tangled in fur for years, the edges worn, smoothed by time and movement. He sat down hard on the edge of the bed, hands gripping his knees. The stove clicked as it heated. The forest outside was still, but something had shifted. This wasn't coincidence. This was something else. He looked over at the creature. It was still, breathing steadier now. Its eyes were closed, lashes dark against skin visible beneath patches of blood-matted fur. The face was not animal, not ape. The brow was strong but smooth, the nose broad but human. The short beard merged seamlessly with its facial hair. And that same light from last night, amber, intelligent, still lingered behind closed lids. Clinton leaned back and stared at the ceiling. A knot had formed in his chest and refused to break. He thought of Owen, of the fire, of the trees that lit up like matchsticks, of the nights afterward, when the only sound in the cabin was his own breathing and the wind clawing at the shutters. He had thought the forest was done with him. He had thought grief was a thing that buried itself quiet in your bones. But now, lying not 10 feet away, was something wild and bleeding, carrying a piece of his son's past. Destiny didn't knock. It bled through the floorboards. Outside, the wind picked up, tossing loose pine needles across the porch. The clouds hung low, fat with snow. A new storm coming. But inside, in the hush of old timber and flickering firelight, something ancient stirred. Not just in the being who lay healing, but in the man who had once watched mountains burn. He stood, walked over, and gently pulled the blanket higher over the creature's chest. His hand trembled. Not from fear, from something deeper. "I don't know what you are," he said, barely above a whisper. "But you're not alone anymore." He didn't know if it heard, but he knew he meant it, and that was the first time in years he felt the room wasn't empty. Not entirely. Outside, the ridge held its breath, and something older than language, older than sorrow, settled into the cabin's bones, waiting for what would come next. Snow hadn't fallen yet, but the air held that waiting stillness, the kind that settled low against the earth and made every sound feel louder. Inside the cabin, the wood stove crackled with an uneven rhythm, throwing long shadows across the floor. Clinton moved carefully, barefoot on cold planks, holding a bowl of warm water in one hand and an old metal tin of antiseptic in the other. The creature, no, the being, still lay where he'd left it, chest rising shallow and slow, its breath whistling faintly through its cracked ribs. The light caught the edge of dried blood still clinging to its fur, and for a moment Clinton just stood there, feeling the weight of what he was about to do. He didn't know if this was mercy or madness, didn't care. He knelt beside it and set the water down, fingers trembling as he peeled back the flannel blanket. The wound on its shoulder had congealed, but not cleanly. Infection was already creeping in. He opened the tin, dipped a cloth in the warm water, and began to clean around the wound with gentle, deliberate strokes. The creature flinched once, but didn't pull away. Its eyes opened slowly, those same amber eyes, and watched him. Not wild, not confused, just watching. Clinton worked in silence, focusing on each movement like it was a ritual. Cotton thread, bent sewing needle. He poured whiskey over both and whispered, "Sorry, buddy," before piercing flesh. The being grunted, low and tight, but didn't resist. Blood welled, then slowed. Clinton stitched with steady hands, the way he used to patch up deer caught in barbed wire or dogs limping back to town after fights they didn't start. When he finished, he set the tools aside and looked up. The creature hadn't stopped watching. Its face, rugged, fur-covered but unmistakably expressive, was inches away now. The brow furrowed, not in pain, but in something else. Recognition. Clinton didn't know what to make of it. "You shouldn't be alive," he murmured. "But you are. So I guess we're both stubborn." He sat back against the wall, stretching tired knees, letting the heat from the stove work into his bones. Later, when night came again, the cabin dimmed to flickering orange and the sounds of the forest drew in closer, as if listening too. The being sat near the hearth now, upright but hunched, a wool blanket draped over its shoulders like an old soldier's cloak. Its hands, large, calloused, more human than not, rested on its knees. It stared at the fire with an intensity that unsettled Clinton, like it remembered something that fire had once taken away. Clinton watched from his chair, sipping weak coffee, unsure whether he should speak. But it was the silence that broke first. The creature moved, slow and deliberate, reaching for a piece of firewood. Not to throw it in, not to stoke the flames. It turned the log over in its hands, then raised one finger, broad nail, not a claw, and began to carve into the bark. The sound was soft but steady, a whisper of motion against grain. Clinton leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. The symbol that took shape was one he already knew. A stream curling around a peak. The same one etched into the metal fragment. The same one Owen had once carved on his ranger tower as a joke, calling it the heart line of the ridge. Clinton's breath caught. The creature finished, set the log gently down beside the fire, and turned its face slightly toward him. Not all the way. Just enough to acknowledge that it knew he'd seen. Outside, wind shifted. From the north this time. With it came a sound. Not wind, not coyote, not owl. A low rumble, drawn out and distant, like the earth itself clearing its throat. The being stiffened. Clinton rose. "You hear that?" he asked, even though he already knew. The creature stood, slow but sure now, and turned toward the window. There was something in the trees, not close, not yet, but moving. Clinton crossed to the door and pulled it shut tighter, then paused. Mud, a boot print, fresh. Right there on the porch, pointed toward the window. Someone had been watching. He backed away from the door, heart ticking faster now. He reached for the lamp, turned down the wick, letting the room fall into hush. Just the faintest glow from the fire now, enough to see the outline of the being as it stepped back toward the corner, lowering itself behind the rocking chair like a shadow folding in. Clinton sat again, ears straining. Outside, silence. But silence-like held breath. He stayed that way for hours, long after the footsteps faded, long after the wind died. At some point, he fell asleep sitting up, chin tucked to chest. When he woke, it was to the soft sound of cloth being moved. He opened his eyes to find the creature standing over him, blanket in hand, draping it over his shoulders. Clinton blinked up at it. "Thanks," he whispered, not expecting a response. But the creature gave one. Not in words, in silence, in the tilt of its head, in the way it stepped back into the darkened corner, content now to simply watch the fire and wait. Later that morning, Clinton stepped outside into the brittle cold, breath fogging in front of him. He crossed the clearing to the trees beyond the shed, instinct pulling him toward the pines. There, at the base of a cedar, he found them. Prints in the dirt. Big ones, yes, but also smaller, more human. Boots, old tread, deep heel. Someone had circled the cabin, stood there, watched. He followed the trail until it vanished into brush, then turned back. Just before the clearing, he noticed something else. On a mossy stone near the tree line, drawn in mud, was a symbol. A crude arrow, pointed north. He didn't mention it when he returned inside. Just stoked the fire, poured himself a second cup of coffee, and sat. The being was asleep now, chest rising in a slow, steady rhythm. Clinton looked out the window again. Whisperridge never felt like home after Owen died. It was too quiet, too full of ghosts. But now, something had stirred, something alive, something hunted. He didn't know who else was out there. But he knew this thing, this creature with blood in its fur and a mountain carved in its memory, hadn't come here by accident. And deep down he felt it. He was no longer alone. That terrified him more than anything. Because if he wasn't alone, it meant he had something to lose again. That night, as the fire dimmed to red coals and shadows grew long, Clinton lay awake listening. Not to the wind, not to the creaks of the cabin, to the breathing across the room, steady trusting, and to the sound of his own heart remembering what it meant to keep something safe. The trees outside shifted in the breeze, brushing against the roof like fingertips. And far off, barely there, came the low guttural cry of something that did not belong to the forest, but had always been part of it. He didn't rise, just listened, knowing the line between safety and discovery was already beginning to thin. But for now, for this one night, there was quiet, and that was more than he thought he'd feel again. The fire pulsed low, the window blurred with frost, and in the hush between heartbeats, the name he hadn't meant to say slipped from his lips without thought. Hollow, a name for something deep, endless. A name that answered, not with words, but with breath and silence, and eyes that opened in the dark to meet his, full of something not wild, but awake. Mornings came slow in Whisperridge, especially in November, when the light didn't rise so much as creep in through the trees like an old friend who wasn't sure he was still welcome. Frost clung to the windows, rimmed the edges in delicate white veins, and made the world beyond the glass look like a memory. Inside the cabin, the fire was down to coals. The air smelled like old pine smoke, coffee grounds, and something deeper, something living. Clinton stood barefoot on the cold floorboards, staring out through the fogged-up pane, coffee in one hand, the other pressed against his ribs like he was trying to keep something inside from shifting. Behind him, the mattress rustled. Not violently, just a sound like someone stirring in their sleep, or trying to remember how sleep worked at all. Hollow was healing. The cuts had closed, the swelling in his shoulder gone down. But it was more than that. He moved differently now, not like something cornered, more like someone waking up in a strange house and realizing they weren't going to be chased back into the woods. Clinton had started leaving the door to the bedroom open at night, half by accident, half by instinct. And Hollow never crossed it, not once. He stayed near the stove, limbs folded tight, back against the wall like he was guarding something, or maybe just learning to breathe in a space that didn't hate him. That morning, Clinton poured another mug and slid it across the table like a peace offering. Hollow didn't reach for it, just watched. But the way his eyes followed the glass, the shape of it, the steam rising, Clinton knew he understood what it was. Later that day, Clinton found him crouched near the footlocker at the edge of the room, one hand hovering over a dusty harmonica. The thing hadn't been played since Owen's last visit, before the smoke, before the ridge turned black. Hollow didn't touch it, just hovered his hand above it like he could feel the sound inside the metal. Then he looked up at Clinton, eyes catching the light just right, and for a second the old man saw something raw there. Not animal, not fear, just Memory. That night the wind died. No howling, no branches tapping, just silence. And in that silence, Clinton woke to the sound of something scratching softly, not frantic, not aimless, just steady. He lit the lantern and turned, heart thumping slower than usual, and found Hollow crouched by the fire, carving something into the side of a split log. Clinton didn't speak, he just walked closer. The carving was a symbol. Familiar. It was the same stream-curled symbol. Again. Same size, same hand. Hollow looked up, saw that Clinton was watching and didn't stop. He just kept carving until the lines were clean and deep. Clinton sat down across from him. "That means something to you," he said quietly. It meant something to him, too. Hollow didn't answer, of course. But his eyes did. They narrowed slightly, like he recognized the name without needing to hear it. For the first time in years, Clinton wished someone else were in the room, not to explain it, not to document it, just to witness it. The next morning, Clinton followed the trail of Hollow's footprints outside. There weren't many. Just soft impressions near the woodpile. One around the porch, and one at the base of a wide pine where the snow hadn't quite stuck. That's where he saw them. Small smears of mud on the bark, shaped like an arrow, pointing north. Clinton stared at them a long time. He didn't call them signs. He didn't believe in omens. But Hollow hadn't done that by accident. It was a direction, a message, or maybe just a memory trying to pull its way back home. He followed it later that afternoon, coat buttoned tight, old boots creaking through frozen leaves. The trail led to a stretch of fencing that had half rotted, held together more by stubbornness than nails. And there, caught in the weeds, was something metallic. A casing. He picked it up slowly, still faintly warm from sun. Someone was hunting out here, not last month, not last year, last night maybe. Clinton stood still, snow whispering through the trees around him. His breath felt loud. The forest didn't. It felt like it was waiting. Back at the cabin, Hollow was sitting upright, turning the harmonica slowly in his palm. Not playing, just holding. Clinton stepped inside, kicked the snow from his boots, and dropped the casing on the table without a word. Hollow looked over, eyes flicking from the brass to Clinton's face, then back. Clinton didn't say a thing. That night the silence broke. It started with headlights, way out past the ridge, swinging back and forth through the trees like searchlights. Then came the sound. Tires over gravel. Voices, not yelling, talking, casual, drunk. The kind of drunk that thinks it's brave. Clinton killed the lamp, pulled Hollow down behind the table. The headlights passed, brushing the side of the cabin. One beam caught the window just enough to throw light across the floor, across the place where Hollow had been sitting seconds before. Clinton didn't move until they were gone. When the quiet returned, it wasn't peaceful. It was tighter. Like a rope pulled one knot closer. He stayed awake all night. In the morning, the radio crackled to life with static. Then voices, two men in town, talking about something they'd seen. "Bigger than a bear," one said, "but walked like a man." Clinton turned the dial off slowly. He knew what was coming. He sat down across from Hollow, stared at him long and hard. "They're gonna come looking." Hollow blinked once, not confused, not surprised, just aware. The sky outside was turning the color of old ash. Somewhere behind it, the sun still existed. But it didn't matter. Something had shifted. Not just in the woods, but in Clinton's chest, the last time he'd felt that weight. It was Owen, watching him from the fire tower, grinning like the world still made sense. Now it was this thing, this not quite man, this not quite beast, and he was starting to understand that mercy wasn't the end of the story. It was the start of a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. The wind returned that night, but softer now. And beneath it, if you listened close, you could hear the breathing again. Two hearts, not quite in sync, but no longer alone. And in the trees outside, something moved without sound, watching, waiting. The arrow in the mud still pointed north, but the danger was coming from behind. Clinton stood at the window long after the fire died, trying to figure out who was more lost, him or the thing he'd let into his home. He didn't find an answer, just a silence deeper than the woods, and a name that now meant something more than emptiness. Hollow, a space between, a space now filled, but never safe, not anymore. It started with voices slurred by liquor and lit by campfire confidence, echoing through the post office, bouncing off the diner booths, slipping between gas pumps and gravel parking lots. 2 hunters claimed they'd seen it near the ridgeline, something massive and upright, lumbering through the trees just before dawn. Not bear, not man, not right. Within hours, Whisper Ridge had a story. By nightfall, it had a name: the Wild Man of the Ridge. Clinton heard the whispers as he passed through town for supplies, the low mutter of suspicion disguised as entertainment. He kept his head down, bought only what he needed, and drove back up the mountain with a knotted gut and white knuckles on the wheel. They would come. It was only a matter of time. By morning, tire tracks scarred the forest roads, fresh, heavy, with mud still wet in their grooves. Ray Lorton showed up not long after, face weathered like the land and just as unforgiving. He wore the same tan field jacket from their ranger days, but the eyes under the brim of his cap weren't soft like they used to be. Ray didn't ask permission. He just stepped onto the porch and said, "We're putting together a group. Something's out there, bigger than anything we've tracked. Maybe dangerous." Clinton nodded, careful not to let his face betray what thudded beneath. "I'm not interested," he said plainly. Ray studied him for a long second, lips tight. "You live closest. If you see anything—" "I'll keep watch," Clinton cut in, voice flat. Ray nodded once, but the way he looked past Clinton's shoulder into the cabin made it clear he didn't believe a word. That night, beams of light slid across the clearing. High-beam flashlights, headlamps. They crawled over the porch rails, swept across windows, lingered at the base of trees like eyes with nowhere to go. Inside, Hollow crouched in the darkest corner of the room, breath low, still as stone. Clinton moved through the shadows like he was made of them, his fingers ghosting over the lamp switch, the latch, the curtain edges. His heart beat loud in his chest, but his steps stayed quiet. When the first light clipped the window, catching just the edge of fur, Clinton reacted without thinking. He grabbed Hollow by the arm, not harsh, not sudden, just firm. "This way," he whispered. They slipped out the back, into the cold hush of night, Clinton leading the way with a lantern hooded by his coat, feet finding the path he hadn't walked in years. Up through the brush, over the low ridge, until the trees opened just enough to show a sliver of rusted steel in the moonlight. What was left of Fire Tower 9. It groaned under its own weight now, half rotted from snow and wind, but the bones of it still stood. Clinton climbed first, slow and careful. Hollow followed without hesitation, silent as mist. Inside, the floor was dust and memories. He'd expected the box of gear to be gone, picked clean by animals or weather. But it was there, tucked under the cot like someone had hidden it not from the elements, but from the world. He pulled it out, hands shaking, the metal cold and sharp against his palms. Inside, beneath a stack of yellowed ranger maps, lay a smaller tin. On its lid, etched faintly in knife-scratch lines, were 2 letters. Ow. Owen. He opened it slowly, and there it was, the missing half. A piece of tarnished brass, shaped like a river curling through mountains, almost identical to the one Hollow had carried tangled in his fur. He laid the 2 pieces side by side. They fit, cleanly, perfectly. One from Owen, one from him. He didn't speak, couldn't. Hollow reached out, touched the brass gently, and let his fingers linger. Then, slowly, he pointed to the far wall. An old support beam where someone had carved something once, barely visible now beneath moss and dust. It was the same symbol. Clinton closed his eyes. This wasn't random. Somewhere, somehow, Hollow had known Owen, and Owen had trusted him enough to leave behind something that only Clinton would understand. The sound of boots on frozen earth shattered the quiet. Clinton tensed, motioned for Hollow to stay low. He slipped out the back of the tower just as Ray stepped into view. Flashlight beam sweeping side to side. The light caught on the tracks Clinton had left. "Clint," Ray's voice was wary, low, already suspicious. "You up here?" Clinton stepped into the path, hands raised. "Couldn't sleep," he said casually. "Thought I'd stretch my legs." Ray studied him. Then his eyes drifted past, toward the tower. "You come all the way up here to stretch?" Clinton forced a tight smile. "Old bones don't care for porch steps." Ray didn't smile back. "Seen anything?" Clinton hesitated. "Just trees," he said. Ray took another step closer. "You know what folks are saying, Clint. You always were the quiet one. Always saw things before the rest of us. You sure you're not hiding something?" There it was, the edge. Clinton held the silence like a breath in his chest. Then he said carefully, "I'm hiding a lot of things, Ray, but none of them are yours." Ray didn't speak for a while. Then he nodded once, like that answered something, and turned back toward the trail. But the tension didn't leave his shoulders. It followed him all the way down. Clinton waited until the trees swallowed Ray whole before going back inside. Hollow was still crouched near the beam, one hand resting lightly on the old carving. Clinton sat beside him. "They won't stop coming," he said. "Not after this." Hollow looked at him, the light from the lantern throwing soft gold along the line of his cheek, catching on the faint wet in his eyes. Not fear, something else. The cabin was no longer safe. Not for either of them. And outside, the ridge wasn't whispering anymore. It was holding its breath. The brass emblem rested in Clinton's palm, warm now. Not a relic, a message. And he wasn't sure who it was meant for anymore. Owen, the creature, himself, maybe all three. The wind picked up around the tower, rattling the loose shutters. And far below, the lights of town flickered through the trees like distant warnings. Clinton leaned back, his spine against the wood, his knees drawn tight. He didn't sleep. Not that night. Maybe not again for a while, because something was coming. Not just the hunters, not just the questions, but a reckoning, and the fire that had taken his son might not have finished what it started. Down in the valley, someone lit a torch, and the forest, once again, had to choose who it would protect. The cold came sharper that morning, settling into the cabin like a warning. The kind of cold that whispered things through the floorboards, through the thin seams of the walls. Clinton stood at the sink, staring down into a cup of untouched coffee, the steam long gone. Outside, the trees held still. Not silent, just waiting. Like they knew something was about to crack. The dogs never barked anymore. Not since the night the lights swept past the windows like searchlights through fog. Not since he saw the boot prints circling the porch. Not since Ray's words. They came just after noon. 3 trucks, 2 with empty beds and 1 full of gear. Nets, cages, something that didn't belong in these woods. 6 men climbed out. Ray was the only one Clinton recognized. The rest were new, armed, loud in the wrong way. One of them spit in the snow and grinned as if the hunt was already over. Clinton stood on the porch before they could knock. His breath hung in the air. Ray kept his voice calm. "We're going to take a look around, Clint, just making sure there's no danger." Clinton's hand was already at his chest, fingers pressed just below the collarbone. He let his voice hitch. "Just enough. You might want to take it easy. Doc says my heart's not what it used to be." The lie slipped out like a prayer. Ray hesitated. One of the younger men stepped forward, but Ray stopped him with a glance. "You okay?" Clinton gave a slow nod. "Just a little lightheaded, but come in if you must." Inside, the air turned brittle. Every footstep echoed too loud. Hollow was hidden under the floor again, wedged beneath a trap door that hadn't been opened in years until that first night. Clinton had stacked crates over it, tossed a rug, made it look like nothing. But still, his ears rang with every shuffle of boots on wood. The men searched. They opened cupboards, poked behind the wood stove, looked under the cot. One man kicked at a board near the wall, then stepped back with a shrug. Clinton leaned hard on the table, one hand gripping the edge like it was the only thing keeping him from collapsing. "Nothing," one of them muttered. Ray didn't look convinced. His eyes kept drifting to the corners, to the shadows that didn't quite sit right. Then something shifted. A drip, soft, barely there, but enough. A single drop of blood, no larger than a coin. had fallen through a gap in the floorboard and landed on the boot of the man nearest the stove. He looked down, frowned, bent. Clinton's heart slammed. "Cut yourself?" the man asked, glancing at Ray. Ray stepped over, squinted at the droplet. Clinton felt the walls closing in. But Ray straightened slowly. Could be from an old deer skinning. Cabin like this, there's always something soaked into the wood. He didn't sound convinced, but he didn't push. Clinton exhaled through his nose, slow. After 20 more minutes, they left, one by one. Ray was the last. He stood on the porch, didn't speak for a long while, just looked out at the trees, hands in his pockets. Then he turned and said, without lifting his gaze, "You've always had a strange way of picking what to save, Clint." And then he walked away. The trucks rumbled off, tires biting into frozen gravel. Clinton stood there long after they were gone. His knees shook, not from the cold, but from what almost happened. Inside, he dropped to the floor, pulled the rug back, lifted the trap door. Hollow was there, curled tight, breath shallow but steady. His hand was pressed to the beam above, fingers curled into the wood. Clinton offered no words, just helped him up. That night they didn't light a fire, didn't speak. They just sat in the dark, listening. Sometime past midnight, gunshots cracked through the stillness. Not random, targeted, far off in the direction of the old tower. Clinton was on his feet before the echo faded. He grabbed the flashlight, the rifle he never used, and bolted out into the snow. His breath came hard, his legs burned. But he didn't stop. The trees closed around him, but the path was familiar. He followed the trail like it was calling him back. At the base of the ridge, he saw the blood first. Then the tracks, huge, dragging, mixed with boot prints. And then Ray, collapsed near a fallen log, shirt torn, arm wrapped clumsily in a strip of canvas. Clinton dropped beside him. "What the hell happened?" Ray's voice was broken, hoarse. "It found me, or I found it. I shot. Stupid. It didn't kill me." He coughed, a wet sound. "It wrapped my shoulder, left me here, like it knew help would come." Clinton swallowed. "Did you see its face?" Ray nodded slowly. "Not what I expected. Not wild, just tired, like it had been running a long time." Clinton looked toward the trees. No movement, no sound. But he knew Hollow was out there, watching, waiting. He helped Ray to his feet. Together they limped back toward the cabin. By dawn, Ray was asleep on the couch, feverish but stable. Clinton sat at the table staring at the blood on his boots. He didn't cry, but something shifted in his chest. That evening, when he stepped onto the porch, he found something waiting for him. It sat at the foot of the steps, the brass emblem. Whole now, both pieces joined, clean, polished. He picked it up with shaking hands, looked out toward the tree line. Nothing moved, but something had been there, and had left this behind, not as a warning, as thanks. He stepped back inside, placed the emblem beside the old harmonica, then sat down, elbows on the table, eyes heavy. The cabin was quiet again, but not empty. Never again. Outside, snow began to fall, and the ridge whispered his name, not in fear, but in memory, because kindness had cost him something, and gifted him something he didn't know he needed, a reason to guard, to remember, to still believe in mercy, even when the world gave none. The fire never got lit that night, but warmth remained, in the silence, in the shadows, in the space between breaths where the wild still lived, watching, listening, waiting for the next thing worth saving. The morning broke with no bird song, just the wind brushing through bare branches and the faint groan of old wood shifting as Clinton stepped out onto the porch, one hand on the door frame like he needed to steady himself against the quiet. A fine frost covered everything, the steps, the railing, even the brass emblem resting in his coat pocket. He hadn't touched it since the night Hollow left it there, whole and gleaming, pieced together as if it had never been broken. Like grief, maybe. Didn't have to stay splintered forever. Behind him, the cabin was warm, but still. Ray lay inside, bundled on the couch beneath wool blankets, color slowly returning to his cheeks. He hadn't said much since the night Hollow saved his life. Just the same quiet nods, the same steady look when their eyes met. Not gratitude, exactly. Something older, something closer to understanding. The kind that doesn't need words. Clinton hadn't told him everything. Not about the carvings. Not about the harmonica. Not about the way Hollow had watched him like he knew Owen, like he remembered something deeper than just a face. But he didn't have to. Ray wasn't asking questions anymore. At least not out loud. The forest had changed. He could feel it. Not just in the air, or in the way the trees seemed to lean closer. It was in the rhythm of the place. The hush that came before something stepped into view. And that morning, just past sunrise, Clinton saw it. 2 handprints, muddy, side by side on the trunk of the pine near the firewood stack. One broad, the other smaller. Both fresh, the lines still wet, not smeared by rain or faded by wind. As if whoever left them wanted to be seen. He didn't move, just stood there, letting his breath fog the air. It had been days since he last saw Hollow, since the night of the blood and the brass. But this wasn't just him. There was another now, a second presence, careful and cautious, smaller in build, but not in weight. He crouched beside the prints, studying them like they were a message left just for him. Not a threat, not a warning, a kind of knock on the door, but softer, measured, like someone was asking permission to exist. That night, Hollow returned. It happened just past dusk. The light hadn't fully left the trees, but the sky was already darkening at the edges, that soft kind of gray that rolls in before real night. Clinton was inside, pouring a second cup of coffee he didn't plan to drink, when he felt it. The shift in the air, the pressure of someone standing just beyond the wall. He stepped to the door and opened it without fear. Hollow stood near the tree line, barely lit by the fading light. And beside him, half behind his shoulder, was a second figure. Smaller, lighter in frame, covered in the same dark, tangled fur, but with a gentler stance. It moved like the forest itself, quiet, uncertain, but watching everything. Clinton stepped down slowly, hands open, showing nothing in them. The smaller one took half a step back, then stopped. Hollow lifted one hand, palm open, steady, then lowered it like a father calming a nervous child. The moment stretched, held between wind and breath, and then the small one stepped forward. They didn't speak, of course. None of them did. But something passed between them just the same. Clinton met the smaller one's eyes, amber, just like Hollow's, but softer, newer somehow. Curious, not burdened. And in that gaze, he saw the question that always came in silence. "Are you safe?" He nodded, just once. Then they were gone again, slipping into the trees like shadows given shape. But not before Hollow turned back. One last glance, eyes locking with Clinton's like a thread tightening. That night the wind picked up again, pulling at the roof like it was trying to peel away old memories. But inside, the fire crackled, and Ray finally spoke. "It wasn't trying to scare me," he said, voice rough from sleep. "That night in the tower." Clinton looked up from the fire. "It was trying to get me away from the trap." Ray nodded slowly, eyes on the flames. "It tore up my shoulder, yeah, but it could have killed me if it wanted to. Easily." Clinton didn't answer. Ray leaned back, exhaling through his nose. "I'll tell the others I found nothing, that I slipped on the ridge. No tracks, no blood, just a busted arm and a bad story." Clinton stared at him, searching for the angle. Ray met his gaze. "I owe it more than I owe them." The silence after that was longer than most, but lighter somehow, like a weight had shifted off the floorboards. A few days later, the storm rolled in, hard and sudden. Snow hit the ridge sideways, thick enough to blur the tree line and swallow sound. Clinton and Ray spent the day reinforcing the windows, stacking wood, boiling coffee they didn't finish. But just before dusk, something strange pulled them outside. A sound. Not a voice, not an animal call. A clash of metal. Short, sharp, echoing through the canyon like a bell rung too hard. They followed it, out past the edge of the clearing, down near the old creek bed where the stones turned slick and the moss clung to everything. And there, half buried beneath ice and snow, was a trap, massive, crude. Teeth like steel jaws rusted at the hinge. The kind of thing meant not to catch, but to cripple. Illegal, even in a county that turned its eye from most things. Someone had laid it, recently, on a game trail, meant for something big, and someone had triggered it. The spring was snapped. The chain still rattled. Blood streaked the ground nearby, but not much, just enough to show whoever it caught got away. Beside the trap, in the snow, were two sets of prints. Large, one heavier, one lighter, and between them, on a flat stone, a new arrow, drawn in mud. Just like before. Clinton stared at it a long time. Then he stepped forward, knelt beside the trap, and started working the release. It took both hands. The metal bit into his skin, sliced through his glove, drew blood. Ray crouched beside him, grunting as he helped lift one side. "You think they did this?" he asked, not looking up. "No," Clinton said quietly. "I think they stopped here, same as us." When the trap was finally disarmed, Clinton sat back, hands shaking, blood trailing down his wrist. Ray looked at the arrow. "You think that means thank you?" Clinton shook his head. "I think it means do better." They walked back in silence, snow crunching beneath their boots, the wind chasing them like a breath on their necks. That night, Clinton washed the blood from his hands, sat in the dark, and stared at the harmonica resting on the table beside the brass emblem. Outside, the trees whispered, the kind of whisper you only hear when you're not afraid to listen. And in that hush, beneath wind and wood, something deep stirred. Not danger, not yet, just the reminder that kindness had a cost. And someone, something, was willing to share the weight of it. Spring arrived in slow exhales, soft and unsure, as if the mountain itself was learning to breathe again. The snow melted first along the tree lines, then the trail, then finally around the porch steps where Clinton Ward stood one morning with a spade in hand and a sapling pressed against his chest. A young pine, thin and awkward, its roots still tangled with the dark, wet earth from a nursery in town. He carried it like something sacred, not because it was rare, but because it was chosen. He planted it just past the edge of the clearing, where the earth dipped gently toward the ridge, and the wind always carried a low hush through the boughs. He didn't mark the spot with anything, not a plaque, not a stone, just the tree itself, tucked into the soil beside the unmarked grave of a boy who once carved maps into cabin walls and watched stars from the fire tower. Owen had died 15 years ago, but that morning felt closer than any other. Clinton tamped the dirt down slow, hands shaking not from age, but from memory. He whispered something into the wind. He didn't know what exactly, but it felt like an answer to a question he'd never spoken aloud. Later, he opened the back gate. A habit now, one he never skipped. He left it open from dawn until dusk, just wide enough for a man to walk through, or something like a man. The ridge was changing again. He could feel it. That evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the pines to silhouettes, Clinton sat on the porch, fingers wrapped around a warm cup of tea, his boots muddy from the morning. The light poured golden over the field, over the grave, over the new pine's narrow shadow stretching long in the grass. Then he saw them. No sound, just movement. Hollow stepped out first, slow and careful, his massive frame outlined by the last light. Behind him came the female again, smaller but poised, her eyes scanning the tree line, the porch, the cabin, everything. Then 2 more shadows followed, small and unsteady, no higher than Clinton's waist. The little ones moved with a curiosity he hadn't seen before. They lingered near the field's edge, one crouching to press its fingers into the soft earth, the other stepping toward the pine sapling. Clinton stayed still, didn't speak, just watched. The young one at the tree reached out. Its hand hovered over the trunk for a moment, then touched it. Light, reverent, like it understood what it stood for, even without knowing the words. It looked back toward Hollow, then toward Clinton, and for a heartbeat, they all stood suspended in the light, man, beast, and memory, without needing anything to bridge the silence. Hollow approached slowly. When he reached the porch, he didn't stop at the steps. He came close, lowered himself, and leaned forward until his forehead touched Clinton's, gently, like a breath. Clinton closed his eyes. He didn't move, didn't need to. He let the warmth of that gesture hold him steady, let it echo through the hollowed-out places inside him. When Hollow stepped back, the light had faded to soft blue. The young ones wandered back toward the trees, the female waiting with a patience that spoke of trust and distance both. Clinton didn't say goodbye, because it didn't feel like an ending. As they disappeared into the woods, he stood and walked down the steps. Something caught his eye near the sapling. He crouched, blinking in the dusk. The soil around the roots had been freshly disturbed. Gentle scoops of earth packed close like someone had tried to help the tree stand stronger. And just beneath the lowest branch, the bark was faintly scored with a mark. Not a claw, a symbol. The river, winding through the mountain, the same one etched into brass. He stared at it for a long time, one hand resting on the bark. By the time he turned back toward the cabin, stars had started to pierce the dark, one by one. The porch light stayed off that night. Not because he was hiding, but because it wasn't needed. The next few days passed quiet. Ray had gone back to town, quieter than before, but different. He didn't talk about the tower, or the blood, or the creature that had spared him. He came by once, left a loaf of bread and a bag of nails on the porch, and didn't knock. Clinton found them just before noon, smiled without realizing, then went back inside. Some nights he swore he heard something beyond the fence, not close, not watching, just passing through. And always near the sapling, the soil seemed newly tended. Not trampled, not clawed, just touched. Sometimes he found stones near the roots, flat ones, worn by riverbeds, placed gently like offerings. Once he found a pine cone freshly cracked. Another time, a single deer antler, clean and pale. Not trophies, not warnings, just signs. Not for the world, for him. One night, near the end of April, Clinton sat out on the porch again, harmonica in hand. He hadn't played in years. Couldn't remember the last time, really. His fingers felt stiff around the metal, the weight familiar but foreign. He didn't play a song, not a full one, just a note, a hum, then another, then silence. Out in the dark, something answered. Not music, not echo, just the soft rustle of brush moving aside. He didn't look up, just smiled, then let the silence return. It felt right, because the forest didn't forget. Not the kindness, not the pain, not the boy lost to flame or the man who stayed behind, and not the wild thing that once crawled beneath a floor to find shelter when it had nowhere else to go. The ridge whispered. The trees leaned in, and beneath the pine that marked the grave of a son gone too soon, something began to grow. Not fast, not bright, but real. And that was enough. Clinton poured the last of his tea into the soil that night, then went inside, closed the door gently, and left the window open, just a crack. Because sometimes the past doesn't knock. It returns at dusk, quiet, gentle, and full of breath. The night Clinton Ward died, the forest held its breath. There was no wind, no rustle of pine needles, no owls calling from the ridge, no creak of cabin wood under the weight of memory. Just stillness, heavy, as if the trees themselves had paused to listen for the sound of a last breath slipping through a cracked window. He went quietly, eyes closed, head tilted toward the glass, face soft like someone waiting for a story to return. The mug on his nightstand was still warm. A pine cone sat beside it, small and perfect, left by the fireplace the night before. He hadn't said a word about it, just picked it up, smiled faintly, and placed it on the sill beside the brass emblem. Both caught the morning light. Both stayed there after he was gone. The next day, Ray came up the mountain. Found the door unlocked, the lamp still burning low. Found his friend in the chair by the window, the lines in his face finally at ease. He didn't call anyone at first. Just stood there a long time, hat in his hands, staring at the way the man's boots were still by the door, muddy from the last walk out to the grave. Ray didn't cry. He'd done that already, years ago, when he thought the fire had taken everything. This felt different. Like the ending of a song you didn't want to stop but knew had played every note it was meant to. They buried Clinton under the pine he'd planted, the one Owen never got the chance to see. No service, no priest. Just a few folks from town, mostly quiet, mostly curious. Ray stood closest, said the only words that mattered. He stayed, he told them. When everything else left, he stayed. By morning, the footprints were already there, around the grave. Not boots, not shovels, but prints pressed deep into the soft spring dirt. Wide, bare, five-toed, carefully placed. Some of the townspeople thought it was a prank, kids playing games. Ray knew better. A few weeks passed. The ridge quieted again. The talk faded, and summer crawled in slow, laying gold over the grass and thickening the air with pine resin and old secrets. The sapling beside the grave grew fast. Too fast, some would say, as if the soil remembered what had been poured into it. And then one night, a boy named Carter wandered into the ridge. He was 15, from town, living with his aunt since his mother passed and his father disappeared to the kind of job no one asks questions about. He'd run off during a storm, angry at something too big for words, and kept walking until the trees swallowed him whole. The storm turned bad fast. Thunder like mountains breaking open. Wind that bent trees sideways. He didn't mean to get lost, just meant to be alone for a while. But by dusk, the trail was gone, and the sky was too dark to tell what direction meant safety anymore. That's when he saw the first mark. A handprint, in mud, on the side of a mossy boulder. Carter stopped, bent, touched it. It wasn't old, it wasn't smeared, it was perfect, wide-fingered, human, but not. He stood there, heart ticking fast, soaked through and shaking, and for the first time that day, he didn't feel angry. He felt small, and watched. More handprints followed. On trees, rocks, even one pressed into the earth itself where a stream cut through a bend in the ridge. All pointed the same way, and Carter, soaked and shivering, followed. They led him to the clearing, to the pine, to the grave. He didn't know whose it was. There was no name, just a brass emblem resting on the stone, the shape of a river winding through a mountain, polished clean despite the weather. Beside it, a circle of smooth stones. Inside that circle, one white feather, one flat river rock, one tiny carving in bark, an arrow pointing back toward the trail. Carter knelt, not because he meant to, just because it felt right. Like the space demanded silence. Behind him, something shifted. He turned slowly. At the edge of the trees, framed in mist that hadn't been there a second ago, stood a figure, tall, still, covered in thick fur that moved like grass in windless air. Amber eyes, human-like wild man face. No snarl, no threat, just watching. Carter didn't scream. He stood. The creature stepped forward once, then paused. Carter looked down at the emblem, reached for it, then stopped, left it there. He turned back to the trail, followed the arrow. Behind him, the forest closed, not harshly, not to hide, just to hold. By morning, he was back in town, muddy, tired, but safe. He told his aunt what happened. She didn't believe him, but when he placed the white feather on the table, she didn't throw it away. Years later, Carter would return, older, with his own boy in tow. He'd tell him not about monsters, but about mercy, about the kind of people who stay when they don't have to, about trees that grow from memory and footprints that mean you're never truly alone. The grave was still there. The pine was taller now. The cabin gone, sunk into earth and moss and time. But the wind still carried something through the ridge, something you could hear if you stood still long enough, heart open and head bowed. And on clear nights, when the moon rose slow and full, some swore they saw shapes moving at the edge of the trees. Not shadows, not stories. Just beings, watching, not to be feared, but remembered. Because kindness echoes, and the ridge never forgets. Not the boy who was lost, not the man who stayed, not the creature who came back with blood in its fur and memory in its eyes, and not the silence that fell once on the night Clinton Ward's breath left his body like a prayer answered. That silence still lingers, not as an end, but as a beginning, always waiting, always listening, always ready for the next soul to knock, gently, at the edge of the wild. In the quiet spaces between what we see and what we feel, there are stories that don't ask to be told, but instead wait, softly, patiently, for someone willing to listen. This was one of those stories. A story not about the wild things we fear, but about the silent ones we pass by. The ones who, like us, carry grief in their bones, memory in their silence, and hope in the smallest of gestures. Sometimes they walk on 2 feet. Sometimes they knock without hands. And sometimes, when the world forgets how to be kind, they remind us, gently, without blame, that mercy is still possible. This tale wasn't about monsters or myths. It was about something older, something quieter, the space where pain meets patience, where silence becomes language, where staying behind becomes an act of courage, not failure. In a world that teaches us to keep moving, to survive at any cost, there is deep bravery in staying still, especially when it's to hold space for another being to heal. And maybe that's what compassion really is. Not grand gestures, not loud declarations, but the simple act of keeping a door open, of leaving the light on, of listening to something most would rather not believe. Because kindness, when given freely, becomes a kind of echo. One that doesn't fade with time, but deepens, ripples outward, and finds its way into someone else's storm. We often think strength looks like control, like answers, like power. But sometimes it looks like an old man patching wounds he doesn't understand, or a creature laying down its fear at the feet of someone who once lost everything. Sometimes it looks like 2 beings who've both been broken in different ways, choosing to see each other not as threats, but as reflections. The truth is, we don't need to understand everything to offer grace. We don't need to name every miracle to feel it brush past us. And we certainly don't need permission to be the kind of person who protects something sacred, even when no one else sees it that way. What matters is that we try, that we choose gentleness where others choose suspicion, that we trust silence where others demand proof, that we believe still in the quiet redemption of a shared breath, a healing touch, a door left open at dusk. Because maybe the wild isn't out there to be hunted or feared. Maybe it's waiting to be remembered. Maybe it's something we once were, before time, before fear, before forgetting. And maybe, just maybe, it's still willing to forgive us. Thank you for spending your time here with this story. One rooted in sorrow, shaped by silence, but ultimately softened by compassion. If it moved you, even in some small way, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know what stayed with you. What moment caught you off guard? What part reminded you of someone or something you still carry? And if you haven't already, please consider following and subscribing to the channel. These stories are made for people like you, people who still believe that gentleness matters, that the wild has something to teach us, and that even the most unlikely encounters can change the course of a life. Until next time, keep the fire warm, the path clear, and your heart open. The forest is listening, and so are we.